Good morning. This morning I'm going to start talking about the stages of consciousness, and hopefully I'll be able to get up. Yep, got my live feed up on my other iPhone, so I'm good to go. And so today I'm going to be reading from Jung's Map of the Soul, an introduction by Dr. Murray Stein. And this is the basis of the new BTS album, Map of the Soul Persona. And I know that it won't be available to most BTS armies around the world. So I'm introducing parts of this book, which I think will be useful to you in understanding Dr. Stein's points as we go forward. And so today's session is going to be a part of a subsection called the 5 stages of consciousness. Today I'm going to work on stages of consciousness 1 and 2, which seem to be quite relevant to the BTS armies. And then in the next couple of days, I'll be finishing stages 3 through 5. And so here we go. I do have my chat up, and hello, Wellian. Welcome. So I do have my chat up. I will be able to follow your chats on my other iPhone. And so here we go. The 5 stages of consciousness. To get a handle on this question of the development of consciousness in the second half of life, we can apply some general measuring sticks. Jung described 5 stages of development of consciousness, which I will summarize and expand a bit. We can use these to measure and assess development of consciousness in children and also in adults in their later years. And so, what I want to emphasize here first is that awareness and consciousness are 2 different things. All creatures have some sort of awareness. If you're alive, you have some sort of awareness. Even the cells in your bodies have some sort of awareness because they know when to reproduce themselves. So we know from biology now that the human body regenerates itself every 7 years or so, and all cells in your body do that with the exception of bones. But all other cells in your body, and with the exception of brain cells, but aside from those cells, all other cells do regenerate constantly. So if you get a sunburn and part of your skin peels off, your body knows, it has awareness that it needs new skin cells in that place. And therefore, it reproduces those cells for you and you get new cells. And as long as you don't overdo it, you won't get skin cancer. But but anyway, so today I'm going to be talking about the stages of consciousness, though, and this is more than awareness. This is not only awareness, but awareness, consciousness that you are alive, that you will someday die, and in the interim between birth and death, you're going to be developing, and that's the individuation process. So we could think of that in the simplest form in terms of a tree. Okay, any type of tree, let's say an oak tree, will develop as an oak tree, but every oak tree is different. And so it is with the human species as well. We are all born as human beings, but we all will develop differently based on where we are in time and space and who our parents are and how we are educated and so on. And so education is a way to bring us into consciousness. That's its role. And so that's true whether it's your mother teaching you to nurse in the first few minutes of your life, or with your graduate school professors who are PhDs trying to teach you something. They're all trying to make you conscious of some facts that are relevant to what you are doing and what you want to do in your life. So let's say that you want to become a doctor. Well, in order to become a doctor, you have to build up various levels of consciousness. You have to learn how to read and write, and then you have to start understanding how the human body works, etc. And you go up through various experiences. And as you have those experiences, you're more and more conscious. And hello, Gray, welcome. And so, as you have your experiences with education, you become more and more conscious of the various steps. So, in terms of learning biology, for example, we have an excellent biology teacher with us today, and he's teaching us how different organisms work from a technical point of view. And we have to raise our consciousness that way. So today, I've already begun, but I'm going to be talking about the first two stages of consciousness. And so I will read these two sections, which is about 2 pages of Dr. Stein's book. And I'm reading from this book, Jung's Map of the Soul, an introduction by Dr. Murray Stein. And then we'll talk about them. So, the first stage is characterized by participation mystique, a term narrowed from the French anthropologist, or I'm sorry, a term borrowed from the French anthropologist Lévi-Breuil. Participation mystique refers to an identification between an individual's consciousness and the surrounding world without awareness that one is in this state. Consciousness and the object with which one is identified are mysteriously the same thing. There is an absence of awareness of a difference between oneself and one's perceptions on the one hand and the object in question on the other. To some extent, people stay in this state of participation mystique all their lives. For example, many people identify in this way with their cars. They experience all kinds of self feelings about their cars. When the car develops a problem, its owner feels sick, comes down with a cold, gets a stomach ache. We are unconsciously united with the world around us. This is what Jung called participation mystique. Most people are connected to their families, at the beginning of life at least, by participation mystique, which is based on identification, introjection, and projection. These terms describe the same thing, an intermingling of inner and outer contents. The infant is at first literally not able to distinguish where it leaves off and where mother begins. The infant's world is highly unified. In this sense, the first stage of consciousness anticipates the final stage, ultimate unification of the parts into a whole. At the beginning, however, it is unconscious wholeness, whereas at the end, the sense of wholeness is conscious. In the second stage, of consciousness, projections become more localized. After the hit or miss projections in the first stage, some self other distinctions begin to appear in consciousness. The infant becomes aware of certain places where its own physical being collides with outside objects, and it begins to watch out for things and to recognize differences between self and other among the objects in the world around it. Slowly, this differentiation between self and other and between inner and outer increases and sharpens. When good subject object differentiation exists, and when self and other are distinct and clearly different, projection and participation mystique change. This does not mean that projection has been overcome, but only that it has become more localized, focusing on a few objects rather than on the whole wide world. Some objects in the world are clearly now more important and interesting than others because they carry projections and are the recipients of libidinal investment. That means psychic energy. Mother, favorite toys, bright moving objects, pets, father, other people become special and singled out and distinct. So, as conscious development proceeds, differentiation takes place and projection becomes fixed in specific figures. And since projections fall on the unknown, the world offers plenty of opportunity to continue the process of projecting throughout one's entire life. Parents are early major carriers of projection, and the children unconsciously project omnipotence and omniscience onto them. These are what Jung called archetypal projections. The parents become gods invested with powers that people have attributed to the divine. Daddy can do anything. He's the strongest guy in the whole world. Mother knows everything and can perform miracles. She also loves me unconditionally. The shocking realization that one's parents do not know everything and are anything but godlike usually occurs during the teenage years. And then for a time, parents don't know anything at all, another kind of projection. We also project onto siblings. This lies at the root of sibling rivalry and the kind of competitive and sometimes vicious dynamics that go on in families. Teachers and school itself also receive many projections. In fact, numerous figures in our environment become carriers of projection in the second stage of consciousness. This gives people and institutions the power to form and shape our consciousness powerfully, filling it with their knowledge and opinions and gradually replacing our own personal experience with collective opinions, views, and values. This is the process of acculturation and adaptation that takes place in childhood and adolescence. Falling in love and getting married are typically based on massive anima and animus projections, and this leads directly into childbearing and rearing, during which the children become carriers of divine child projections. Like the first stage, the second is one that no one leaves behind completely. As long as one is able to be enchanted, to feel the stir of adventure and romance, to risk all for a mighty conviction, one continues to operate out of projection onto concrete objects in the world. And for many, the development of consciousness stops here. Such individuals continue to project positive and negative features of the psyche massively into the world around, and to respond to the psyche's images and powers as though they were located in external objects and persons. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, but I'll go back and discuss these two stages of psychological development in a moment. Let me just look and see. Okay, there are no chats at the moment, but I will certainly try to respond to any of your chats, and I'm going to continue to talk about these two stages. Now, if you're motivated to, you could buy me a coffee by using the super chat, and all super chats will be responded to. And also, you will find on this YouTube channel over 925 videos about Dr. Jung's work, and so you can, in fact, find a course, a basic course in Jungian psychology. It's the course of a layman. I'm not a mental health professional, but Dr. Jung's work has helped me very much in my life in terms of balancing my psyche over many, many years now, over 30 years. And so that's why I'm so committed to what I'm doing now, because I feel it will help others. And so going back to participation mystique now, this is this is sort of the herd mentality, okay? And we can see it very clearly in all our shopping malls today because you see many people walking around with their iPhone, reading their iPhone instead of paying attention to what they're doing. Now, what are they doing? What they're doing is trying to understand the herd and where they fit into the herd. And so, if you're a young person in junior high school, perhaps, probably you don't have an iPhone before that, but if you're in junior high school, you're trying to find out what your friends are doing and trying to figure out what will be acceptable for you to do and what isn't. And so these same functions happened, of course, before iPhones, but the reason especially young people are so committed to their iPhones is because they are trying to figure out where they fit in the world. And the iPhone is a great source of that information. Now, it's not only young people, obviously. My wife and I, who are beyond 60, and in my case, beyond 70, still keep our iPhones close because we're interacting with the world and we want to understand how people are relating to us. And so we too are keeping our iPhones these days, our smartphones, within arm's reach. And they save us sometimes. For example, now, because my desktop computer isn't accepting my live feed very well, but I know as a backup that I can go to my new iPhone and present a class, and everyone in the world can see that class, and I can make my points. And so there's nothing wrong with looking at your iPhone, but I think you'll probably see more commonly that younger people who are trying to be part of the group, part of the herd, are much more inclined to be using their iPhone while walking or whatever. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I have walked into walls on occasion because because I was looking at my iPhone when I was should have been walking through the mall. So I have once or twice actually walked into a wall, but you can see that among young people, and it's why we can't allow smartphones while you're driving because if you're paying attention to your smartphone, you're very likely to cause an accident. And so I think either the first or second cause of deadly accidents is people using their cell phones. So today, after about 15 years of active development of smartphones and the use of smartphones in society, police officers know to check on people's iPhones, and they can tell to the second what you were doing at any given point. And so if you cause a deadly accident, they're going to know that you were violating the law and looking at your iPhone, even if you hide it away. So let me go back to these comments. I've started to get a couple of comments. Miles says, please talk about the difference between education, what you are doing to educe, and introduction, and how these each relate to individuation. Oh, I'm sorry, indoctrination, Miles has said. Please talk about the difference between education and indoctrination and how these relate to individuation. Okay, so Education is a normal feature of the human species. We're always trying to teach our young people, and we have to learn through life. I mean, my 88-year-old mother-in-law now is glued to her iPhone and is often on computers. So she had to, 15 years ago when she was my age then, she had to learn how to use a computer and how to use an iPhone. So we need to be prepared to learn things throughout life. And this is why I very much favor a liberal arts education over a technical education. And the reason is that, and I'm talking about at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, you are going into a profession, certainly, and you have to learn the specifics of that profession. But what the liberal arts does for you is teach you how to learn. And so if you learn one specific thing, chances are that one specific thing is going to be obsolete very soon, maybe in a month, and maybe in 5 years, or maybe in 10 years. And if you've put all your eggs in one technical basket, thank you, Nets Ghost, I'll come back to your point in just a moment. But if you put all your money into one basket, then it's going to be harder and harder to change as you get older. And whereas indoctrination, on the other hand, is probably the powers that be trying to convince us that you have to believe this, believe this, believe this, believe this. And that's what we get on our cable news channels every day. Uh, one side represents the right and one side represents the self, and maybe one channel is trying to stay neutral as much as it can. But all of these stations, and especially the ones that are identified with the right or the left, are trying to indoctrinate us to convince us that their side is right. And that's not education per se. And so if you're always looking at MSNBC, or you're always looking at on Fox News for Americans, then chances are your opinion isn't going to change. It's just going to get reinforced, and that's indoctrination. If you're watching CNN, which is trying to stay in the middle more or less, although there are certain biases, of course, then it's more education and you have to make your own judgment. And so that's what a good institution does. Now, uh, let's see. Thank you for the super chat. Nats Ghost asks a question. Do you have any personal tricks you've picked up along the way to bring projections into conscious awareness? I'm stalled in what I resist persists. Well, I don't have any really great answers to that, but I think that when you say when I resist, what I resist persists is a good pointer to what we're talking about here, where if you're resisting something, that's immediately a sign that you're um, having an issue that needs to be adjusted in some way, maybe. And so if you're resisting very hard, then maybe we should look at different ways around. So, for example, many Jungian analysts may have poo pooed the idea that BTS is teaching psychology. Uh, and they think, oh, well, I'm a PhD in psychology. I know how to teach psychology. And therefore, this is just poof, nothing significant. Well, those people don't get through to teaching psychology to the masses. Okay, they have a profession. That profession is based on helping a single person get through one of the changes, the transformations in life that are required. And they that may require a long activity or a short activity. And so there are many stories of Jungian analysis that take many years. For example, the dreams of Wolfgang Pauli, which appear in Psychology and Alchemy. Wolfgang Pauli was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he went into analysis for many years with Dr. Jung, and because of that, he provided more than 1,000 dreams. And in his book, Psychology and Alchemy, Dr. Jung picked about 51 of those dreams to show how they demonstrated the process of individuation in Dr. Pauli. Additionally, in this book, in Jung's Map of the Soul, Dr. Stein is referring to the individuation of a European woman who comes to Dr. Jung when she's 57 years old. And her dreams don't appear in Dr. Stein's book, which is simply an introduction. Her dreams appear in volume 9, small Roman numeral 1 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, and there she has made many paintings and so on over a period of time, which demonstrate her individuation process. And so, when certain things happen, then you have to learn that these are signposts that something needs to change. For example, I've many times showed an image of my mother at age 18, and she is a major part of my anima development. And so in that photograph, she has lovely brown hair, very long shoulder length hair. And whenever I see a woman that is like that, and this goes for my ex-wife and my second wife and many other women, my anima says, "Oh, that's the woman for you." And so, and sometimes it brings on a very, very strong psychological effect. For example, when I began this YouTube channel and started to talk to my local group, one of the women who came was a already a psychotherapist, and on top of that, she was a sex therapist, and she happened to have this long brown hair. And on one of the meetings that we had, you may not be able to tell it from looking at the video, but I had this like tunnel vision between me and this woman, where it's like being in one of these movies where everything goes away and is very cloudy and vague, and all you're seeing is the thing that's down that tunnel. And so I was interacting with that woman, and that was my anima carrying me away. Now, in the moment, I couldn't get that projection to stop. But immediately after, since I've had a lot of experience with this now, I knew that this was an anima projection. But many people wouldn't know that. And so a man that has that kind of experience with another woman that is not his wife might go off into the sunset and start having a relationship with that other woman and destroy his marriage, which is what happened to me in my first marriage, because I met my second wife, and she fulfilled many of the desires that I had in my psyche. And I was having problems helping my first wife come to the next level of transformation. And I didn't know any of this at the time because I never studied psychology. And so I couldn't figure out how to fix our problem, that my first wife and I were having. And even though we went to marriage counselors, the marriage counselors were not helpful. And so it's it's important to understand these transformations through life because it might get you through that opportunity. And so if I resist that anima and don't do anything about it, it's it can control you. And it turned out, uh, completely to the knowledge of my second wife, that this psychotherapist and I had dinner together, 3 times, at least 3 times, and we chatted for like 3 hours each time. And and when you have a conversation like that in a secure environment, it's like bringing your intended into the garden, and then you start to interact with one another uh, unconsciously. But she, as a psychotherapist, and me, as someone who knows something about Jungian psychology, were able to land that down, that projection down, to the point where we could become friends. And as it happened, she was going through a difficult time in her first marriage, and she ultimately left her first husband and went to be with another man, but not me. And those conversations that she and I had together may have helped her. I don't know. She later took up Jungian analysis as a possibility for her future development as a psychotherapist. And but if I had resisted it and just said, "Oh no, I'm not going to talk to that woman." I mean, we hear this from our vice president, who's afraid to be alone with another woman. Uh, he can't sit with another woman and chat with her at a dinner unless his wife is right there to protect that situation. And, that's a sign of immaturity, actually. And so we need to understand how these things work. So I hope that that's a useful response. Many marriages could be saved. Probably my first marriage could have been saved if I had known something about psychology. And uh, and it was sort of at that point that I got the incentive to start studying up on it and understanding transformations. And you have to understand the transformations that your spouse is going through too, because uh, they are going to be different. They're going to be different from yours, and you have to be tolerant of those and work through those things together, or at least in your own psyche, maybe pray about them. I don't know. And Count Keypat says, "Yes, say it louder, sir." Okay, I think I've said it as loud as I can. Seesaw says, "Yeah, sir, how is archetype different from virtue in respect to an individual trying to adopt good personality and not just responding as one has been doing it for the whole of childhood?" Okay, archetype is like a dry riverbed. It is a pattern that is within all of us. And so if we think of, in the case of men, let's talk about the warrior archetype. All men have the warrior archetype within them. Women, too, to a certain extent. We all have all of these archetypes, although the warrior archetype is typically pointed to for men. And so that's a pattern that men go through. And it leads to the hero's journey, but the hero's journey is for both men and women. It's a little bit different for the two genders, depending on um, con- traditional ideas. But when something happens, so for me, the warrior archetype was there. I was the son of a naval officer, so I was raised in the military. And so I knew I would have the urge to be in the military. And young men often take up their father's work, so because their father can best train them for that work. In my case, my father didn't want to train me to be a military man because he knew what the costs were. And so he never really encouraged me. But from an early age, I was fascinated. And so I took his yearbooks from the Naval Academy, and I would pore over them when I was a little boy, and probably from age 5 or 6. I would go through and look at the pictures and try to understand what they were. So that was water being put into that archetype. And that was always there in my personal psyche. And just as the archetype of mother is in all women at the patterning level. But here I was putting water into this warrior archetype by looking at the pictures of my father as a young man and seeing my father in action because my father was a career naval officer. So I saw him in uniform and we visited many military bases. So all that was water that was being put into the warrior archetype. And but then and so it made me want to resist the resistance to the Vietnam War. I had a very negative reaction to the anti-war movement during the 60s, and I won't go into it in great detail, but I went to a college that is traditionally on the left end of the political spectrum. So I was the only one in my class from my college who entered the military as a second lieutenant on the day we graduated. On the day we graduated from college, my father came with me to the dean's office, and my father swore me into the Marine Corps. But before that, I had known that I was going to go someday to Vietnam at some level, at some unconscious level. I was aware of that. And I knew that my best chances of survival, let's say, would be if I was an officer and not an enlisted man. So I knew that I wanted to go to OCS. I couldn't get in the Navy. I wanted to be a naval officer like my father, but the Navy had very strict vision requirements at that time, so I wasn't able to get into the Navy. But I was used to seeing Marines around because the Marines are part of the Department of the Navy. And so in my junior year of college, when a recruiting officer came to the campus, I literally had to fight my way through Vietnam War protesters to get to the recruiting table so I could talk to the Marine officer that was doing the recruiting. But I didn't really know what I was getting into per se. I just knew I wanted to go to officer candidate school, and because there's great competition between the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army, I knew I didn't want to go in the Army. And so I signed up, and that summer, between junior and senior year of college, I went to officer candidate school. And so then I had only one more hoop to pass, and that was to graduate from college. And so when I graduated from college, on that day, I became a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And I was the only member of my class that joined the military on that particular day. Ultimately, 16 of us did serve out of 180. It was a small college. But um, but I was the only one on that day. But when I went into Marine Corps training, then there was this flood of life experiences that related to the warrior archetype, and they totally overwhelmed me. So I became completely a U.S. Marine at that point. So that was the archetype taking over me. But that archetype also is in all men. So there was a very telling exchange between Anderson Cooper and two older Muslim men in Paris immediately after the the attack on the club in Paris that killed over 100 people. And so there were many news media and heads of state in Paris on that event. And so Anderson Cooper went around and he asked these two men, what is causing these these young men to go and join these so-called jihadi organizations? And I use that term in the secular sense, not in the religious sense. Um, and the answer they had is, think of it, they don't have any way of proving that they are men. And, many of them were living in relative poverty in, um, in Paris. In Paris suburbs, there are many Muslims living in poverty. And so, in that environment, these young men have no way to show that they're men. And so they go off to these jihadi armies to prove that they are men, maybe to themselves. But you can prove you're a man also by going to medical school or becoming a lawyer. It doesn't mean that you have to take up arms. And um, so let me go back to this question. Um, so morality, on the other hand, um, is rules. Okay, typically, and so Seesaw is saying, what about adopting a good personality? Well, it's not quite that easy, but the point is that the morality of culture, wherever that may be, um, is a bunch of rules which may or may not work for you. For example, um, a Muslim woman will wear a hijab, which shows that she's ready to live within, as a mature woman, within the culture of Islam. And so it's a symbol of that. Whereas in the United States, Catholic women very often will wear a veil or something over their head when they go uh, to mass, and it's it's a symbol of being a mature woman in a Catholic environment. Now, as I understand it, that rule has been eased in the Catholic Church, so women don't now have to do that. Um, but many of them still do, and they wear some headgear, and it's supposed to be a sign of humility, but women have started to wear hats, which are very outrageous. And whether that's a sign of humility or not, I don't know. But in any case, these moral ideas are often culture rules. And the problem is those culture rules are not have been loosened by the scientific method. And so the scientific method has demonstrated that certain myths in any religion are no longer true, are not true, and so those laws of that culture are not being honored um, as much as they were. And so this is the development of religion that has to come to within us and not only dictated by traditional religions. And this is part of the point of Jungian psychology, that Dr. Jung penetrated to the source of all religions. And so the source of all religions is the deep unconscious of all of us. And um, and so we are coming into an age where, uh, by psychology, we have to have morality. And by psychology, I mean being able to decide for ourselves what is right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what's good and what's evil. And we have to recognize that evil does exist in the world. And so the basic idea is, again, to go back to this Job archetype. As we're learning how to be human beings in the first half of life, we're being educated, we're learning the rules of being a human being. Um, During that time, we have to follow the rules. But ultimately, we have to get to a point where we can decide for ourselves what is right and what is wrong. And all of us have two streams of spirit coming up from our unconscious. One can be called the right hand of God, and one is the left hand of God. And it depends on who you are, which side is right. But by developing a strong ego over childhood and early adulthood, you can decide for yourself the difference between right and wrong. And so the reason that I emphasize going out and making mistakes, having experience of making a mistake and then lamenting about your mistake and then being reborn into the next thing tomorrow, is because that builds up your ego to the point where you can consciously make a decision between right and wrong. And so that's the difference between archetype and morality. Archetype is a pattern that once it's constellated, it's like a record. It's going to play all the way to the end. It's not going to stop. In other words, when the mother archetype is constellated in a woman, uh, then that record is going to play through for the rest of her life, that pattern of human existence. And there's no getting out of it. Uh, you can't kill your child and get out of it. You can't have an abortion and get out of it. Motherhood is going to be an archetype that you're going to have to live for the rest of your life. And this is true basically of all archetypes, although other archetypes are not as strong. So by experience, you learn what is right and what is wrong for within your culture, within the human species. Um, and so I hope I got the explanation clearly enough for you. Um, and So Sherry says, just popping in to say hi. Hi, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to continue. Okay, see you soon, Sherry. Nats goes, my animus projections in the past have been so wild. I'm glad I'll be at least somewhat aware in the future. Hindsight is humbling. Laugh out loud. Yes, stay aware. Learn to converse instead of diving in. And so, that's part of what happens during the honeymoon period. In the honeymoon period, we see this person and they're the perfect person. And that lasts maybe for 6 or 8 weeks in a marriage. But ultimately, you start to wake up to the fact that this person you married isn't precisely what your animus or your anima had in mind, and you start to see flaws in that other person. And that's when the real work of being married comes in, because both of you bring only half of the story to a marriage. So think of the yin yang symbol, right? And one of you is yin and one of you is yang. I'm not saying which one is which, but one is one thing and one is the other. So that's where the truth of my coffee mug comes in, which says, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer is yes, he is, because he's only bringing in half the story. And the other half um, of the story is brought by your wife. And so she has a point of view too, and the two of you need to negotiate certain issues that are contentious between you. And the same goes for women, by the way. If a woman is alone in the desert and speaks and no man hears her, is she still wrong? And the answer again is yes, because the woman is only bringing half of the story. And so what we have to understand is that there are opposites that are brought together into a wholeness, which is the two of you as a couple. And there are going to be points of friction in that wholeness, okay, down the line between the yin and the yang, or well, down the line between the yin and the yang. And so you have to know that there's going to be raggedy edges there, and you're going to have to work those things out between you. And so once you understand, to Nat's Ghost, I'll say, once you understand that it's the animus is controlling your decision about men in one way or another, then you can probably write down what are the features of a man that you really want. And you'll probably be, in some ways, describing your animus. But if it becomes a projection that you say, oh my God, that man is perfect for me, then you better get into a conversation and start understanding what that person really is, what they're like, what their politics are like, and so on. Because if everything is different from you except for this projection, then you're going to have a hell of a time in a marriage. But if everything is the same, it's going to be too boring. And so you need to have some friction within a marriage. That's on this line between the yin and the yang. There needs to be some friction in order for there to be, um, you know, a development. In my own case now, my wife and I are both INT, but she's J and I'm P, and so we have um, a fairly nice marriage because we think alike in a lot of ways, but um, she loves to work with spreadsheets and databases. I like to work with ideas. And she goes to the grocery store with a list and focuses on that list, whereas I go to the grocery store and pick up what I want. So the other day, I went in and I had two specific things I had to get: milk and coffee. But and my wife was going to wait in the car while I did that. But while I was in there, I also picked up a bunch of other things, including Italian ice, which we both like, um, but we hadn't mentioned and it wasn't on a list. But then this morning, she's challenging me because there was a shopping list that was being made. Um, and I hadn't taken milk and coffee off the shopping list. So I said, "Oh, hey, just like the funds." I say, "Oh, so okay, I didn't take it off the shopping list because when I went in for that short thing, when I was only looking for two things specifically, I knew what I had to get. I got them, And it never occurred to me to look at the shopping list, but that's how my wife and I differ. Um, okay, uh, so Natsuko saying running away, thanks. Well, diving in or running away. Stay where learn to converse instead of diving in or running away from a possible uh, relationship with someone. And Nats goes, I wanted to reply to the indoctrination question with a quote from William Blake. May God keep us from single vision and Newton's sleep. If someone hands you a single vision education, there is no space for multi level vision and personal growth into a subject. For me, that's the difference between education and indoctrination. And that's a fair enough point. I certainly agree with that. Um, but we all have to try to talk about these things. When anytime anyone says a word, including these words that I'm saying right now, that's all part of the logos. And so you can agree or not agree, but it's all part of the logos. And but when you then have to take the experience of what you may have learned from this conversation or whatever, or when you have to take your education and go out and do something, then that comes from the irrational side. So someone may think they want to become a surgeon, so they learn all the rules of being a surgeon and so on. And maybe they even get through the dissection of a cadaver, which you have to do in your first year of medical school. But when suddenly you're faced with this person here on this table is alive, and it's my responsibility to fix them surgically, then that's when you get in, that's when the rubber meets the road, and you have to have the psychological experience of being a surgeon. Not everyone is cut out for that, obviously. Um, Miles says, thank you, Nat's Ghost. It also includes the importance of individuation as being fundamental. Yes, we're either going to individuate consciously or we're going to get dragged on by the individuation process, and the result may not be good, and we'll say we were unlucky or we had a bad fate. And so for me, let's talk about luck for a minute. I do believe in luck, but my definition of luck is favorable random accident positively exploited. In other words, we all have luck things chance happening to us all the time, every day. Something that is chance happens to us. And what we have to be able to do to be lucky is to be able to draw from that lucky accident and see it as a good accident and exploit that good accident, make it do something for us. If we don't see those good accidents, then we're not going to be lucky. Also, I hope that's sensible. Um, And Natsuko said, writing down what I think I want in a man as a way to perhaps exploring the animus. Yes, I'll do that. That's a good idea, I think. And, that came from my deep unconscious. In other words, I've never thought of, up until now, I've never thought about that as a method for exploring one's own anima or animus, but I think it makes sense, and it's a way to concretize those things. And so that's why I use the photograph of my mother, because I recognized that pattern where whenever I saw a woman with long brown hair, shoulder length hair, uh, I'm immediately attracted to her because of that image. But she may be totally inappropriate for me in one way or another. Um, And so I think if you do that, whether you're a man or a woman, if you write down the features of what you're looking for in a spouse, you may start to get a sense of what your anima's ideal is. And it's the anima's ideal or the animus's ideal which causes you to fall in love, to have love at first sight. You just see that person and you know that's the right person. In the case of actually both of my marriages, that's what happened to me. My animus said, yep, this is the right person. And fortunately, in the second case, I was I'm very happy with the selection made. And in the first case, I was happy with it for a long time. I was married for 17 years and was the father of three daughters during that period of time. But there were frictions that I didn't know how to deal with those frictions. And now I do because I've studied Dr. Jung's work. And so, and it basically comes down to having the idea that, whether you're a man or a woman, you don't have all the answers for your being a couple. And so you have to negotiate with your spouse to have both of you being on the same page. And that's a lifelong process. And, that's a credit to all people who have a 50 or 60 or 70-year marriage. People like, the Queen of England, who's now in her 90s, but, she and Prince Philip obviously went through many trials. This is spelled out in the television program, The Crown, but they managed to get through it and to stay together and have what, for all intents and purposes, is a perfect marriage in a very, very difficult archetypal situation because she had to become the archetypal queen for all Britons. And that is a very big trial. Okay. So, Miles says, I am not sure what Newton's sleep is exactly. I think it was that he dreamed of an apple falling and a feather falling and broke the mold that apples fall faster in a vacuum. Each land at the same time. Okay, I too am not sure about the reference to Newton's sleep, and I hope you'll elucidate that, or maybe you have done. Natsko says, to me, Blake is pointing out the single vision of the rational scientific approach to understanding the ontological nature of reality. The West has really run with this and has excluded the other. And that's obviously true. When we use words like ontological nature of reality, no one's going to understand what you mean, including me. I mean, I'm not sure of the definition of ontology. I've looked it up many times, but it just goes off my head. And the complete sentence is, the West has really run with this and has excluded the other avenues to understanding this nature, the same way people oppose BTS, precisely. And the point was well made in one of these amusing videos about BTS, where men are presented with BTS for the first time, and at first you see the expression on their face being they just don't know how to react to it. They're just stunned, and then gradually you see that they kind of like it in some way, and they don't know why, and it's sort of an ineffable thing. But one of these fellows made a very good comment. He said, I question my left brain, which is where the rational part is, and there's nothing there. And that's right, okay, because what BTS is doing in all of their presentation, in their words, in their music, and so on, is typically right brain material. It's from the irrational, which is from the life side. And in the West, particularly in the United States, we've gone way, way out on the scientific method rationality side to the expense of life, to the expense of our irrational side. And this is what BTS represents. It represents life and it represents a compensation. And so, one of the things that Dr. Stein points out in this book, Jung's Map of the Soul and Introduction, is that um, there's two sides of this puzzle, and we need to understand what that is. And I've a couple of times mentioned Notre Dame as an example. Notre Dame, the building, is from the rational side. Anything that you see that's structural, including this screen behind me, had to be produced by a rational process. But then uh, the reason I like this screen is irrational. Okay, it's something that I can't explain in detail. I mean, obviously, it has something to do with the fact that I lived in Japan for 8 years of my life, including some of my formative years from age 15 to 17. Um, but beyond that, I couldn't begin to tell you what the symbol of a shoji screen behind me means, and because that's totally irrational. And so, what BTS represents is something coming from the irrational. I remember what I wanted to say about Dr. Stein's work. It's compensation. Okay, so what our dreams are typically is a compensation. So think about all the opposites that operate in our psyche, and that's where psychic energy comes from. If you pull very far back on one side of any set of opposites, the other side is going to be pulling back just as much. For every action, there's a reaction. And so an enantiodromia sets in, which is the tendency of things to turn into their opposites. And suddenly there's a snapback. And what dreams do is they offer a compensation because you relax your conscious mind, you go through the day, and dreams are speaking about right now, typically, where you are right now on all measures. And so let's suppose during the day that you're pushing, pushing, pushing in one way, and there has to be a compensation. In other words, the rubber band has to be brought back into the center again. And so your dreams offer that. And so sometimes they're profound and telling you something you weren't conscious of, and sometimes they're in some ways silly. For example, I've talked about the fact that at a time that I was unemployed between ages 39 and 41, that was a very shocking time for me. I really was just on the beach and knocked out of the system, and I didn't understand why. And I had all these execution dreams. I was being executed by firing squad, by hanging, by beheading, all these different dreams. And they would always wake me up in shock. And on reflecting on it, I thought, well, they're telling me I need a job. And then I say to my unconscious, well, tell me something I don't know. Of course, I knew that I needed to find a job as a adult mature man, and finally I did find one, obviously, and since that time I founded and built up a company from a chat on my back porch to a public company. And uh, so many things happened subsequent to that, but these execution dreams were compensating, saying, "Man, you got to get a job." And I'm saying, "Yeah, tell me something I don't know." Okay, I know that. but my dream wasn't wasn't talking about what was just what I was thinking consciously. It was looking at my total situation and saying, "Man, you're going to fall out of society if if you don't get with it." And of course, I knew that, so I did get with it ultimately. Um, Now going back. Um, so there is an underlying nature of reality, and what we have to understand, and Dr. Jung's point is that many people think the psyche is not real, and that's not true. And so in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job, he says, people think that the psyche isn't real, but he said those people must assume that either the laboratory or equipment or the uranium itself developed the atom bomb, which it didn't. But you can look around your room and everything that you can see, except potted plants, everything that you can see um, is an object of the psyche. Okay, in other words, every product in your household, anything you see looking around your room, is was made by the psyche. Okay, it was made using rational method, and so it was made by the rational method in the physical world. But there's also the psychic world, the psyche, and it's in the psyche that how to make that product comes from. Okay, uh, and so you have to understand that the psyche has value, and that it's the only thing that actually does produce anything, um, because it wasn't the masonry that built Notre Dame. It was the psyche of men and the imagination of men and women. It wasn't the rocks, and it wasn't the trees or the wood that was put into the church. It was or into the cathedral, I should more correctly say. And, but what caused them to do that came from the irrational side. And it came from visioning and imagining not only how to build it, but also what it means. And all that comes from the irrational side. So Miles says Newton was apparently really trying to find God, and this led him to discover great science. Yes, and he did a lot of writing on God, and that's mostly been pushed away by people who think that the rational method is everything, which it is not. And he says now physicists are saying things like a consciousness preceded the Big Bang and the material world. Well, I don't think anybody knows what preceded the Big Bang, but um, obviously there was something before it, and we don't know what. And so that's part of the mystery. I've got strength says, my significant other is not the love at first sight. He's somehow similar to the members of BTS. I didn't like them from the first sight. Two, only after knowing them better, I love them. And, people don't tend to love me at first sight because they can't figure me out. And so my experience growing up, because I moved so many times with my father, is that I was always on the outs. Okay, so I would come into a new classroom. There would already be cliques that had formed, and so I had to sit over in the corner, and I learned to be an introvert and to keep myself going from my introversion. But it would only be after 6 or 10 months that people would start to interact with me, and then they would see, oh, this guy has something to offer. And so then I would tend to get joined into the cliques and the groups, but it wouldn't happen immediately. And let's see. And so she says, I wonder what it says about my animus, that I don't know. That's something between you and your animus, and you should start taking notes and trying to figure that out. They all fit into this type: slim, with not very short hair, looking young, but I wasn't crazy when I saw them. Um, that goes in the vein of what Skip is talking about. Newton is the rationale for Blake, which couldn't include Blake's more irrational approach, right? Yes, laugh out loud. The scientific community is beginning to integrate it. Yes. Avenues, but not during Blake's time. Yes, unfortunately. And Blake actually was a terrific psychologist. And so there's this book, which I have read into the YouTube channel. It only took me an hour and 15 minutes to read the entire book, but it's called Encounter with the Self. And in that book, Dr. Edward Edinger took the 21 plates that these are etchings that Henry William Blake developed near the end of his life, of the life of Job and the book of Job. And uh, so Dr. Edinger went back and interpreted these plates, and he calls the that book his portable analytic hour. So William Blake knew intuitively, at a very deep level, what was going on in the book of Job. And I think most Christians have, if there's any part of the Bible that Christians are put off by, it's typically the book of Job, because they don't understand the trials that Job went through, and the book of Revelation. But once you understand Jungian psychology, then you can go back and really appreciate the beauty of that piece of literature. So William Blake um, drew on printing plates backward, um, his ideas of what was going on in the book of Job. And it includes a lot of inscription of words that he had to etch in backwards so that when they printed, they would print forward. So it's a brilliant piece of art. And Dr. Edinger then went through those plates, and which you can find online. Just look up William Blake um, Job etchings or something like that, or the book of Job and William Blake, and they come right up in many different forms. And they're not covered by copyright because William Blake died in 1825. And so he actually intuitively saw the steps that one needs to go through in analysis of individuals. And so if you go to the homepage of this YouTube channel and listen to those two videos that I put there, you'll find it on the YouTube channel with black and white images about Edinger's portable analytic hour. It will really benefit you, because you then understand the steps that the psyche goes through at any given time, and it can really help you analyze your situation. Um, and so the amazing thing is that Blake actually was a prefiguration of psychology, if you want to think of it that way, and it came from his intuition, from his deep unconscious. Miles says, I had a dream flying around in a big modern helicopter last night as a passenger. I really felt woozy looking down at the earth flying by. And I'm sorry, I don't comment on other people's dreams and visions. So you you need to think about what that means, Miles. And since I know you somewhat, I can make some guesses, but which I might do in a personal conversation, but not on a general and only from a layman's point of view. I'm not saying anything about your psyche, but I have some ideas based on that, which you can take as you and I going out for coffee and just chatting about this stuff. Seesaw says, in my dreams, my friends often speak to me that I think too much during simple conversation or game. This hurts me, but I feel some truth that I am telling that to myself. And probably you are, because as Dr. Stein says, our unconscious is offering compensation. So it's resetting the rubber band back at zero every night, and it does that by compensating for what's happening in your conscious mind. And so that's my observation there. Next, Ghost. Encounter with the Self, Blake, Job, Blake's Prince, Reed, just to remind me later. Yes, and as I say, I've read them into the YouTube channel, and you can find them on the homepage. So it's a brilliant book by Dr. Edinger, and obviously the plates are quite brilliant. Um, and Miles says, I must admit, Skip, initially I was reluctant to subscribe to your channel and joining the advanced reading group, but something said to me, give this guy a chance and some time. He has something. Well, thank you, Miles. I appreciate that. Okay, so I have gone through the first two stages of consciousness today. I will do the next segment. I don't know whether it'll be one or two stages of consciousness tomorrow, but this will be a series of stages of consciousness. So, in the hope that this gives all BTS armies a perspective on where they fit in the consciousness development process. And, that's a matter for self evaluation and self reflection. And so I'm not going to make any judgments about any given person where they are in this spectrum that goes from participation mystique then to this projection of parents as gods, and the idea of projection coming in the second phase. And so I'll talk about the third, fourth, and fifth stages in the next one. And let me see what. Sorry, so I had another comment come up. Opiami says, "Do you know?" Message retracted. Okay, well I couldn't read it. I've got strength says, I mean, when you talk about anime, you are pointing out that people are attracted to a certain image, but I'm not that attracted to the image itself. It doesn't make me crazy. That's what I wonder about. Okay, so when Dr. Jung talks about image, he doesn't necessarily mean a picture. Okay, he means something that speaks to your soul. And whether that's music or a tone of voice or any number of other things, the anima is all of those things. It's not necessarily only a picture or an image. Um, if I react to BTS as purely a rationalized scientific method scientist who says, "Oh, there's nothing here on the rational side," then I might not like BTS. But obviously, women are reacting to it very positively, and so when I had some statistics for BTS coming across my iPhone this morning, and uh, both of them said that men who are watching BTS is only 8%, 92% are women of all ages. Okay, so watching BTS is putting me in this 8% of men watching it and liking it. And also understanding it, okay, because I do understand it. I've grokked it. I got it, okay, and I've got it because I've been working on Jungian psychology for the last 30 years, and Dr. Jung was primarily working on the psyche side, on the irrational side, and and so I know that. And then when I see BTS, I say, yes, there's nothing there on the rational side for a man, okay, necessarily, except for a small group of men, okay? Um, and most of them don't know why, okay? But now, because the women are being attracted to BTS, now the men are going to be forced to come back and take another look. And if they can understand uh, what it is that BTS contributes to society in multiple ways, then they're going to get into it. And so, when I saw it and started to react, and I very quickly got educated by BTS armies who told me this whole story of how BTS developed and who they are as men, as educators, as philosophers, as very mature and individuated individuals. When I saw Kim Nam-jun's speech to the UN, it was just a remarkably mature speech. Okay, it's one of the most mature speeches I've ever heard from any individual of any age. And I said, wow, okay, so I'm going to pay attention to this young man because this is a highly individuated young man. Now, I'm not saying he's going to have a perfect life because he's certainly presenting as a persona that presented at that UN session. That was not the persona that he presents on stage, but he went back, and Dr. Stein has commented on that he is very connected with his unconscious. So he and his unconscious have a very strong connection. And so he does grok a lot of what Dr. Stein and what Dr. Jung are talking about. And so as he matures, he's going to run into other trials and tribulations. I mean, the BTS group as a group can maybe get away with the kind of dance moves they do for another, you know, 4 to 10 years, let's say. But for the same reason that professional athletes tend to fall out in their 30s, the same is going to happen with BTS because they can't hope to do all the very quick dance moves and the jumping around that they currently do and the spinning around that they currently do. It's quite remarkable for as choreography, but as you're aging, you can't do that anymore. Okay, they're not going to be any 50-year-old BTSers that are performing in quite that way. I'm not saying they won't have similar performances to what they're doing now, but they're going to be toned down performances compared to what they can do as a young man. So, I mean, it's a very athletic thing what they're accomplishing incredibly. And, I, for example, I was used to be critical of male ballet dancers, right? And until one of my high school teachers pointed out that look at what athletically it takes to perform the male role in a ballet. It takes huge strength. You need to be able to lift the woman up into the air and hold her up there for periods of time. You need to do all these pirouettes and other moves and these leaps like Baryshnikov was famous for. And that's huge athleticism. And to be able to do that, I mean, there's probably no member of the NFL that can uh, just physically perform the things that a male uh, ballet dancer is called upon to perform. Yes, they can perform these very brute strength activities and they build up their weight so that they can do these brute strength things. But in terms of performing the way a ballet dancer performs, there's no way. And so, I learned very early on, thanks to a teacher in high school, to really respect um, what these guys do, what Nijinsky and Baryshnikov and those guys do. It's amazing and it's beautiful, and it's a hugely athletic and masculine thing to do. And so I'm looking at the BTS guys, and I think most American men will react to their presentation as relatively effeminate. But if if you look a little closer, their moves and their arm gestures in their dances are not effeminate at all. They're very masculine um, and very aggressively masculine in many respects, and so it it takes some patience to see it, but it's definitely there. So uh, I think many men might at first glance say, "Oh, well, this is all just a bunch of gays doing this," but that's not it at all. This is a very smart approach to getting people's attention and moving up, and with 92% women in the fan group, man, men are going to change their attitude, and we need to. That's the compensation that we've had 25 years of hyper masculinization and all that stuff. And, except the guys that do that typically aren't, they're not Marines. They're just pretend Marines in many cases. Because if they say "oorah," that's not Marines. That's not what a Marine says. A Marine says "oorah," okay, and that's quite different. And so if you hear someone say "oorah," they're not a Marine, okay, because that's not how a Marine reacts. And I'm sure I shocked you, but nonetheless, uh, you have to. There's a qualitative difference, and so somebody who says "oorah" and pretends that they're a Marine, that's you can recognize the persona, the mask that they're trying to present right away, and and so we have this kind of faux masculinization of society, that that now we need a compensation from, and that's what BTS represents. And so we need a readjustment in society, and we're getting it from BTS. So more power to them. Um, Now let's get back to these further comments. Um, so I've got strength says, so I must have misunderstood it as the visual thing. Um, yeah, I mean, when Dr. Jung is talking about images and we think in images, um, an image can be Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Okay, there's no image there, but it's an image that I can hum the tune of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and that's an image in my psyche. But it's all about music and sound, like bum 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 bum. Okay, that comes from an image that I have in my psyche, but it's not a picture per se. I could secondarily make it a picture by imagining what those notes look like on sheet music. Um, but when we talk about music, sheet music is the rational, but it isn't the music. It's just a map of the music. And a poor player, or somebody with a bad singing voice, can say bum 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 bum, and you know what I'm referring to, but it's terrible. But Van Cliburn commented that it isn't playing the notes that's significant, it's what's between the notes that's significant. And that's entirely irrational. And that's what is the difference between just a piano player and an artist. Okay, a piano player can play out the notes maybe, but they can't express the emotion of the music. Um, Miles says, look at Early Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi in the 80s versus now. John is in great shape for a guy today, but not the same as he was. Opiami says, true, Skip, a man and a woman need to hold themselves up. Let me find a vid to knows that shows this. Nat's Ghost says, I've got strength. Um, you might be aided by learning about your anima and your communication with it by a quick read of NLP, representational systems. Yes, and NLP is a very interesting psychological approach that's worth knowing about. I have in past years used NLP uh, quite a lot by understanding simply mirroring. And so you should look up mirroring and NLP on Google. But basically, what it says is that I'm going to mirror whatever you do. So if you scratch your head, I'm going to scratch your head with the arm, with the opposite arm, so it mirrors you. And so when I do this, and I'm looking at myself in the iPhone, um, I am see- I am seeing myself doing it with my left arm, but actually I'm doing it with my right arm, and so this is my right arm, not my left. But in the mirror that I'm seeing from my iPhone, I'm seeing it as my left arm, and so if you mirror someone, it unconsciously connects them with you. And so throughout my business career, after I learned this, I started to do mirroring consciously until I inevitably now do it unconsciously. So whenever I'm meeting with someone face to face, I'll always mirror them because I know it makes an unconscious connection with that person for whatever purpose. And I used it very heavily and often in my business career. So that is one example of NLP. That's Ghost. MP really helped me with understanding my subjective experiences, and it certainly can. Um, and I think Nat's Ghost is probably referring to N and P in the Myers-Briggs context. Correct me if I'm wrong, since we were talking about NLP, but I think when you say N small p, you're talking about the fact, which, because that's my personality type, also where you let your intuitive side, your global thinking side, and your perceiving side face the world and understand the world. And it's not always correct. I mean, I make a lot of assumptions that later on prove not to be true. But but nonetheless, that's my personality type. So I know that I make an assumption about something and then it turns out not to be true. But I also know from perceiving that things will happen without me planning everything out. Okay, so in other words, I'm in this video right now. I did plan in a J kind of way what I was going to start with, reading from Dr. Stein's book. But I also knew that once I started to interact with you on this video, that I didn't need any detailed planning. I couldn't have planned out the things I've talked about in this video. But I knew from a perceiving point of view that if I just started talking, that would engage my unconscious, myself. And, if I had tried, I couldn't have planned this video in any way. It would just have been dull and dead. So, anyway, let's see. Okay, so I think I've gotten to the bottom of the chats for now. We can continue on in comments after the video becomes live for playback. So I'm going to discontinue for today and I will resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. And we'll talk about one or two more stages of psychological development. And then we'll go on to more of my extemporaneous thinking, to the extent that's thinking.